The hike had been smooth so far, just a peaceful stroll through dense woods. The sun was beginning to set, stretching long shadows across the ground as I continued on. Today, I chose to try a lesser-known trail, one I'd read about but never explored. It was said to offer stunning views and tranquility, exactly what I needed. As I walked, the forest grew darker. Although the sunlight was fading, the trees here were packed closer together, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. The cheerful chirping of birds had vanished, replaced by occasional rustling in the underbrush. I paused briefly to check my map. I had veered off the main route but was still following a marked path. I reassured myself there was no reason to worry. I pressed on, my steps crunching against the dry leaves scattered across the trail. The path began to slope downward, and soon I noticed a faint, unmarked trail branching off to the side. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to follow it. It seemed it might lead to a scenic overlook. The trail was narrower and more overgrown but appeared to open up ahead. As I ventured further, the trees grew even denser, and the shadows seemed to deepen around me. Suddenly, I heard it, a low, steady thudding sound. My heart started to race. I froze in place, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me and continued onward. Before long, I arrived at a small clearing. In the center sat an old wooden chest, partially buried under a layer of fallen leaves. It looked oddly out of place. Cautiously, I approached and opened it. Inside, I found a few rusty tools and some aged, yellowed papers. One paper appeared to be a logbook filled with strange symbols and cryptic notes. Another was a faded photograph of a man with a stern expression. A shiver ran through me, though I told myself it was just the cold. When I turned to leave, I realized the path I had followed was gone. The forest seemed to have shifted, the trees now closing in tightly around me. I tried retracing my steps, but there was no trace of the trail. Panic began to creep in. I pulled out my phone, only to find there was no signal. I had no choice but to press forward, hoping to find my way back. Hours passed. The last light of day was nearly gone, and I stumbled through the thick underbrush, branches scratching at my skin. The rhythmic thudding sound returned, this time louder and closer. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace. I needed to get out of there. Finally, I stumbled onto a broader trail. My legs ached, and I was scratched and covered in dirt, but relief flooded over me. The trail led me back to the main path, and eventually, I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. Exhausted, I climbed into the car and drove away. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something lurking in the dark trees. There was nothing but the black forest behind me. I promised myself I would never wander off the trail again. The experience left me shaken, but what truly unnerved me happened when I got home. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed my phone had a new notification. It was a photo of me standing in the clearing, the old wooden chest visible in the background. I didn't recall seeing anyone else on the trail, and I was sure I had been completely alone. A cold chill ran down my spine. Whatever had been out there, it had been watching me all along. I've always been drawn to the thought of staying in a secluded cabin surrounded by trees. The idea of escaping the constant hum of city life and spending a weekend immersed in the stillness of nature was something I daydreamed about often. So, when I stumbled upon an affordable listing for a rental cabin, I couldn't resist booking it. The drive to the cabin was serene. The road was flanked by towering trees, their foliage becoming denser as I drove deeper into the countryside. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. The crisp, cool air was refreshing. The cabin was small and rustic, with a little porch and a single rocking chair. Simple but inviting. After unloading my bags, I decided to explore the surroundings. A narrow trail wound its way into the woods behind the cabin. I followed it for a while, soaking in the sounds of chirping birds and the gentle rustling of leaves. There was a faint smell of smoke in the air, which I dismissed as possibly coming from another cabin nearby. As dusk began to fall, I returned to the cabin, prepared a simple meal, and settled down with a book. The silence was comforting, and before long, I found myself drifting off to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by an odd noise. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like something lightly striking the side of the cabin. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The sound was too consistent to be just a tree branch brushing against the wall. Reluctantly, I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward the front door. The tapping grew slightly louder as I neared the door. Taking a deep breath, I flung it open and shone the flashlight into the night. The beam revealed nothing unusual, just the dark silhouettes of trees and the stillness of the woods. As suddenly as it had started, the sound ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Uneasy, I retreated inside, locked the door, and climbed back into bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed magnified in the quiet. The next morning, under the reassuring light of day, I stepped outside to investigate. Everything looked normal. I inspected the cabin's exterior but found nothing that could have caused the noise. Trying to shake off the unease, I decided to take another walk, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. The day passed uneventfully, and by evening, I felt more at ease. After dinner and some reading, I turned in for the night. Once again, I was jolted awake by that same persistent tapping. This time, it sounded louder, more deliberate. Gripping the flashlight and my phone, I tiptoed to the front door. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, bracing myself for what I might find. As soon as the door opened, the tapping stopped. The woods were unervingly quiet. I scanned the area with my flashlight and caught a flicker of movement in the bushes nearby. The beam illuminated a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. My breath caught, but then the creature stepped into view. A deer. It stood frozen for a moment before darting off into the trees. My fear ebbed, but the unease lingered. I locked the door firmly behind me and resolved to leave first thing in the morning. When morning came, I packed quickly, a sense of urgency driving me. The cabin, which had initially felt like a peaceful retreat, now felt oppressive. As I loaded my car, I glanced back one last time. It looked serene and quiet, but I knew I wouldn't return. The woods had their mysteries, and I was content to leave them behind. Later, I learned that the area was known for frequent wildlife activity. The steady tapping I heard might have been caused by a woodpecker, and the other noises could easily have been nocturnal animals. But as I lay in bed that night back in my apartment, safe from the unknown, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had been watching me. Then I remembered that faint smell of smoke from my first walk. I discovered later that years ago, a fire had swept through those woods, claiming the lives of several campers. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but as I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard that same rhythmic tapping again, this time coming from the window right behind me. I had always loved hiking, so when I discovered Harper Trail, a route known for its breathtaking views and complete solitude, I couldn't wait to explore it. The starting point was serene, the air crisp, and a wave of excitement washed over me as I entered the thick woods. The first stretch was mesmerizing. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. I followed the winding path as it led me deeper into the wilderness, savoring the tranquility. But as I ventured further, the trail became harder to discern, overrun with thorny plants and dense undergrowth. I pressed on, thinking it was all part of the experience. The forest was alive with sounds. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves offered a soothing backdrop. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The sudden stillness felt eerie, and a chill crept over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. My confidence began to waver as I noticed I was losing my sense of direction. I had been careful to note my path, but none of my markers seemed visible anymore. A sinking feeling of panic set in as the towering trees seemed to close in around me. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction appeared identical. My heartbeat quickened as the reality of being lost set in. Hours passed as I stumbled through the dense thickets, each step heavier than the last. Exhaustion weighed on me, and the sky darkened to a foreboding gray. My phone had no signal, and my hope was fading fast. My thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to focus. I had to find a way out. Then something odd caught my eye, a faint trail of disturbed leaves. It wasn't much, but it was the only sign of direction I had. Clinging to that small glimmer of hope, I followed it, pushing through the tangled vegetation. The trail led to a small clearing where I found an old, decrepit outpost. It looked abandoned and eerie, but it offered a semblance of shelter. I hesitated before stepping inside, my nerves on edge. Inside, I found a dusty map and a worn-out radio. I brushed off the map and studied it, realizing the outpost was marked on it. With that, I plotted a route back to the main trail, hoping it would guide me out. As night descended, I managed to get the radio working and called for assistance. Help arrived quickly. Relief washed over me when I saw the rescuers, who led me back through the forest. When I finally emerged into the open, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also unease. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the darkened woods. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear I wasn't alone. That silent, shadowy presence left me with an unsettling chill. The forest wasn't just a place of natural beauty. It harbored something far more sinister, and the thought that it might still be out there, waiting, haunted me long after I left. One evening, I made the decision to head out on my first solo camping trip in the forest. Life in the city had left me drained, and the thought of spending a night beneath the open sky seemed like just what I needed. I picked a spot by a small, serene pond encircled by dense trees. The area was still and calming. After pitching my tent, I collected some firewood and lit a campfire. The crackling flames felt warm and soothing as the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reflected beautifully on the water. I cooked a simple meal and soaked in the peaceful atmosphere. Everything seemed ideal. As darkness crept in, the sounds of the forest grew more distinct. The hoot of an owl, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the distant chirping of crickets filled the air. Though the noises made me a little uneasy, I reminded myself that these were just the usual sounds of nature. Sitting by the fire, I watched the flames dance until drowsiness began to take over. After extinguishing the fire, I zipped up my tent and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night air was colder than I had expected, and the silvery glow of the moon filtered softly through the branches above. At some point during the night, a strange noise jolted me awake. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard. My pulse quickened as I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of leaves as something heavy moved just outside my tent. With shaking hands, I reached for my flashlight and a small camping knife. I switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then the growling abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening as I lay there, heart pounding, trying to hear any hint of movement. After what felt like hours, I cautiously unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The night seemed calm once more, but a sense of unease lingered. Convincing myself it must have been a wild animal passing by, I zipped the tent shut and lay back down. Sleep came slowly, each faint sound keeping me alert. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight filtered into my tent, making everything feel a little less daunting. I carefully stepped outside and scanned the area. The campsite appeared untouched, but I couldn't shake the discomfort lingering from the night before. As I packed up my belongings, something caught my attention, something that sent chills down my spine. In the dirt near my tent were massive footprints, far larger than those of any person or common animal. The tracks led away from my campsite, disappearing into the dense woods. I didn't waste time investigating. Quickly packing up the rest of my gear, I began the hike back to my car, a persistent feeling of being watched gnawing at me the entire way. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, relief washed over me. Driving away from the forest, I made a silent promise to myself never to camp alone again. What had started as a quest for tranquility turned into a night I would never forget, a stark reminder of how vulnerable we are in the wilderness. Though I returned home safely, the memory of that eerie night stayed with me. Occasionally, I find myself lying awake at night, the crunch of leaves echoing in my mind, and I wonder if whatever was out there is still watching, waiting for the perfect moment to remind me that, in the vastness of the wilderness, I am never truly alone. I've always loved hiking by myself. The stillness of the forest, the sound of my steps crunching the ground, and the crisp air made it my favorite way to unwind. One weekend, I chose to explore a new path I'd read about on a forum for outdoor enthusiasts. It was described as moderately difficult but promised stunning views. The first couple of hours were incredible. The trail was steep and uneven, but I felt energized. I reached a small clearing where I paused for a break. I sipped some water and glanced at the map. According to it, I was near a scenic viewpoint that overlooked the valley below. As I continued, the trail became harder to follow. It looked like very few people had been here recently. Bushes and tree branches started to obstruct the way, and I had to push through. The sky began to darken, even though it was still early afternoon. Heavy clouds rolled in, and soon I felt raindrops on my skin. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the lookout before the rain turned into a downpour, but the trail seemed to vanish. It hit me I was lost. Anxiety started to creep in. I tried retracing my steps, but the surroundings all looked the same. The rain grew heavier, and daylight faded quickly. I kept walking, hoping to spot something familiar, but the slick ground caused me to slip. I landed hard and pain shot through my ankle. When I tried to stand, it was impossible. My ankle was badly injured, possibly broken. Alone, hurt, and lost, I realized I had to think fast as nightfall approached. I sat down and forced myself to stay calm. Digging through my pack, I found the whistle I always carried for emergencies. I blew it as loudly as I could, hoping someone might hear. The sharp sound echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Every few minutes, I blew it again, but only the rain answered. Time dragged on. The rain lessened to a drizzle, but the cold seeped through my soaked clothes. Shivering, I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my pack, conserving heat. I kept blowing the whistle, clinging to hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard something, distant voices and footsteps. Desperately, I blew the whistle again. The voices grew louder, and beams of light pierced the darkness. Relief flooded through me as two hikers emerged from the shadows. They had heard my whistle and come to investigate. Supporting me between them, They slowly helped me back toward the main trail. Every step was agonizing, but I was grateful not to be alone anymore. After what seemed like hours, we reached the trailhead. They drove me to a nearby clinic, where I learned my ankle was indeed broken. The hikers stayed until I was treated, then left once they knew I was safe. But something about that night wouldn't leave me. As I lay in the hospital bed, I kept replaying the moments before they found me. The voices I'd heard earlier, before the hikers appeared, had sounded different. There had been too many voices, too close, and they didn't match the two hikers who had rescued me. When I asked them later if they'd encountered anyone else, they looked confused and told me they hadn't seen another soul the entire day. The memory clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. The forest, which once felt like a refuge, now carried an unsettling weight, a feeling that I was never truly alone out there. After that night, I stopped hiking solo. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, had revealed a hidden side, something I wasn't meant to uncover, something that still sends chills through me whenever I think about it. The sun was sinking low when I decided to explore a fresh trail in the hills near my town. I always enjoyed discovering new routes and escaping the hustle of urban life. This path was unfamiliar but clearly marked, weaving through dense trees and rugged slopes. The cool, crisp air felt perfect for a late-day hike. As I ascended, the trail grew steeper and narrower. Long shadows stretched across the ground, making the woods seem darker and more unsettling. Determined to reach the peak before nightfall, I quickened my pace, spurred on by the setting sun and my eagerness to take in the view from the top. At last, I emerged into a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. The horizon was painted in vibrant shades of orange and pink, and I found myself captivated by the scene, momentarily losing track of time. But as the sunlight faded completely, I realized I needed to make my way back down. Navigating the trail in the dark would be challenging. When I turned to head back, the path seemed unfamiliar in the dim light. I couldn't spot the trail markers and felt a surge of anxiety as I guessed my way forward. What had felt like a serene forest now felt suffocating and ominous. Every rustling leaf and snapping branch made me flinch, though I reassured myself it was just the wind or small creatures. The terrain became more treacherous, and I slipped on loose rocks several times, grabbing onto tree branches to steady myself. My legs ached, and the chill of the night seeped through my clothing. When I checked my phone, I saw the battery was nearly drained. I knew I had to find my way back quickly. I eventually stumbled upon an overgrown, forgotten trail. It wasn't the route I'd taken earlier, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. I followed it, hoping it would lead back to the main path. The trees seemed to close in tighter around me, their branches snagging on my clothes. I kept moving, trying to stay composed. Then I heard a low growl. My blood turned cold as I froze in place, straining to hear more. The growl came again, this time closer. Slowly, I turned my head and saw a pair of glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It was a large predator, likely a cougar. My heart raced as I cautiously backed away, never breaking eye contact. I recalled reading that making yourself appear larger could deter an attack. Summoning my courage, I raised my arms and shouted as loudly as I could. The cougar paused, then retreated into the shadows. I didn't hesitate. Fueled by adrenaline, I ran through the forest, not stopping until I recognized a familiar trail. Relief washed over me when I realized it would lead me back to the parking area. Even so, I kept up a brisk pace, the encounter with the cougar fresh in my mind. The forest felt less intimidating now, but I remained on edge, every sense heightened. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, drained but grateful to have made it out. As I sat there catching my breath, a nagging sensation crept over me, that I was still being watched. I glanced back toward the dark trail, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw those glowing eyes again, just beyond the treeline. Without waiting another second, I started the car and drove away, my heart racing. The drive home felt tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to spot those eyes trailing me. I knew it was unlikely, but the fear lingered. The hills, so peaceful and inviting by day, had revealed a far more dangerous side by night. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the faint sound of a growl outside my window, a chilling reminder of that encounter and the wild, untamed world just beyond. I had always been drawn to the thought of spending a weekend by myself in a cabin, so when I came across one available for rent deep in the forest, I seized the opportunity. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a break from my hectic city life. I arrived on a Saturday evening as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt driveway. The cabin was modest but inviting, with a small kitchen, a loft-style bedroom, and a fireplace. After unpacking my belongings, I prepared a simple meal and settled down with a book for the evening. At first, the stillness was calming. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of an owl. But as the hours ticked by, the silence began to feel unsettling. Every creak of the wooden walls sounded magnified. I kept reassuring myself it was just the old structure adjusting to the night air, but an odd sense of being watched crept over me. Hoping to shake the unease, I went to bed earlier than usual. I was awakened in the dead of night by a sound outside, a rustling, like something heavy moving through the undergrowth. My heart raced as I cautiously got out of bed and peered through the window. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a silhouette near the tree line. It appeared to be a man, though it was too dark to see clearly. I tried to convince myself it was likely a hiker or perhaps a hunter who had wandered too far. But the figure stood motionless, and the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. Eventually, I forced myself back to bed, pulling the blankets over my head like a scared child. The next morning, I couldn't shake the lingering tension. To clear my mind, I decided to take a walk. The woods were stunning in the daylight, and I began to feel a bit foolish for my fear the previous night. However, during my stroll, I stumbled across footprints in the dirt leading away from the cabin. They were human prints, fresh and deep. I followed them briefly, but they disappeared into a denser part of the forest. Uneasy about venturing too far, I turned around and headed back. When I reached the cabin, a chilling sight stopped me in my tracks. A single footprint on the wooden porch, right by the front door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left the lights on and kept a kitchen knife by my bedside. Around midnight, the sound returned, this time closer, right outside the window. My chest tightened as I crept to the window to peek outside. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away. This time, I could see him clearly. A scruffy-looking man with tangled hair and filthy clothes. He was staring directly at me. Panic set in as I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no reception. I was completely alone. Determined not to feel helpless, I gripped the knife, opened the door, and stepped outside, but he had vanished into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, with the blade in my hand, my breath shallow and fast, unsure whether I felt more foolish or terrified. By morning, I had made up my mind. I hastily packed and left, not sparing a single glance behind. I reported the incident to the rental agency, but they assured me no one had ever reported anything unusual before. Perhaps it had been a wanderer passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something sinister. Back in the city, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. Yet, on some nights, I still hear noises outside my window. When I summon the courage to look, I sometimes catch a glimpse of what I swear is that same figure, standing motionless, watching me from a distance. I even moved to a different neighborhood, hoping to escape him, but I can't help but wonder, what if he followed me? What if he's still out there, waiting,